Jesus says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Whoever has my commandments and observes them is the one who loves me. In our gospel today, Jesus wants us to understand that the love of God, if it is truly authentic, must be reflected in a life of obedience to his will. Another way of putting it is that genuine love of someone must be expressed by our obedience to them. It would not make any sense if we said that we love somebody, but then we did not do what they asked of us. That would be hypocritical. That wouldn't really be love. Rather, when we truly love someone, we will desire to do what they ask of us, no matter how difficult that may be. What is meant by that word obedience? It's a word that we use all the time in the talk of religion, but also just in life in general. Obedience is the virtue that inclines our will to comply with the will of another who has the right to command. In other words, an obedient person is someone who submits his or her will to someone who possesses legitimate authority over them. We are asked to obey human authorities in certain things as long as their laws are not opposed to God's laws. And ultimately, we are asked to obey God in all things. Obedience to God is to be without limit. Obedience to God is a duty. It's not something that is optional. In fact, God commands obedience from us. In the book of Deuteronomy, God says, I set before you this day a blessing and a curse. The blessing if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you this day. So there it is. Obedience is required of us. But not only that, God asks us to show our love for him through our obedience. In other words, our obedience, even though it's required, it's commanded of us, it should naturally flow from our love for God. All of us need to cultivate this virtue of obedience in our lives, no matter what state of life we're in. We priests need to obey our bishops. And this is hitting home with a lot of priests in our diocese, as in most of us will be getting a new parish assignment come August. Religious sisters and brothers, monks and nuns, they need to obey their superior. Children need to obey their parents. All Christians need to obey God's words found in Scripture. And all Catholic Christians need to obey God's commandments and the teachings of the Catholic Church, as the Catholic Church is the instrument through which God speaks to us. And yet, how often do we struggle with obedience? Obedience is one of the hardest virtues to cultivate. It's not easy to submit our will to someone else's, especially if what they're asking of us seems difficult. And this struggle happens with our faith. There are many theological doctrines of our faith that are quite mysterious. Here's some examples. The Trinity, how there can be one God, three persons. The Incarnation, how Jesus can be both fully God and fully man. All seven of the sacraments are mysterious in certain ways. For example, the Eucharist, how bread and wine are transformed into the body and blood of Christ. Baptism, how once baptized, the Trinity dwells within the soul forever. The priesthood, how an ordinary man's soul can be forever changed to be able to act in the very person of Christ. Confession, how through the priest's ministry all of our sins are wiped clean. And holy matrimony, how one man and one woman can be made into one flesh. But the things of the church, the things of God that are most difficult to obey are usually the moral teachings. The moral teachings of Christ in the church. They can be very difficult to understand, the reasonings on why those teachings are what they are. For example, why God says certain things are sinful and why certain things are not sinful. Teachings such as why it's obligatory to attend Mass every Sunday and holy days. Teachings on marriage, sexuality, fertility, respect for life, etc., etc. To summarize, there are some things about our faith that we just don't fully understand. And we have to be okay with that. God does not ask us to understand everything. But what he asks of us is to obey him, even though we don't always understand. So what happens when we come to a commandment of God, a teaching of the church that we don't fully understand or we don't fully agree with? Well, we have one of two options. We can either, in faith, say, God, I don't fully understand, but I will obey it anyway. Or we can choose not to listen to that particular thing. And really, choosing not to abide, to listen to the thing that we don't understand, that's actually a very frequent temptation. Sometimes we have an attitude of, I agree with most of the church's teachings and the commandments, except this one. So I just won't follow that one thing. Or this commandment of God doesn't apply to me, so I don't need to listen to it. If this is an attitude we have, we need to get rid of it right away because it is very spiritually dangerous. We don't want our faith to be like a cafeteria line in which we simply pick and choose what we want to believe. There's nothing wrong with not understanding something fully, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to grow in our understanding and knowledge. But there's a problem if that lack of understanding causes us to completely disobey God. God asks us to be obedient in all things, not just in the things that we want to believe, not just in the things that we fully understand. Obedience to God is without limit. If we have the attitude of, I'll obey all of God's commandments except this one or that one, it reveals a weakness of faith. It reveals a lack of humility because we're behaving as if we know more than God does. And ultimately, it reveals a lack of commitment to love God fully. As Jesus says today, if you love me, keep my commandments. He didn't say, if you love me, keep the commandments that we want to keep. He said, if you love me, keep my commandments, period. True love is obeying God in all things, regardless if we understand it all. So when we obey God in all things, even though we don't understand something, that reveals deep humility, deep faith, and deep love. A good analogy of this is a child's relationship to their parents. Most children at some point disobey their parents, and for various reasons. Sometimes the kids think that they know more than the parents. Sometimes they don't fully trust their parents. Sometimes they don't understand why their parents are asking them to do a certain thing. And sometimes it's just that the children desire to do what they want to do, and that desire to do what they want overrides their love for their parents. I guarantee that almost all of us disobeyed our parents when we were young. I know I certainly did. Just ask my own parents. But I also bet that there were also times in our growing up years in which we did obey our parents, even though maybe we didn't fully understand them. On our good days, we had an attitude of, I really don't understand what you're asking me, Mom and Dad, but because I love you, I will do it anyway. That second scenario, that's where we want to be in our relationship with God. I don't always understand what you ask me, God, but because I love you, I will follow it. We also probably discovered that when we were children, and when we did obey our parents, something good always came from doing what they told us to do. Maybe we didn't realize it in the moment, but maybe years later, looking back on that experience, we realized, what they told me to do, it was for my own good. I just didn't know it at the time. The same is true with God. Even though we don't understand everything, there's always good that comes from obeying Him, because God, who is perfect, always desires the best for us. So obedience to Him is always for our good. We may not see it in the moment, but we will see it definitely down the road. When we obey God, we will always be blessed by Him. There are two saints I want to briefly mention who exemplify this virtue of obedience. The first is Venerable Fulton Sheen, who will soon be declared blessed. He was an American archbishop of the 20th century. Sheen was ordained a Catholic priest in 1919 for the Diocese of Peoria, Illinois. After being ordained, he went to the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. to obtain further education. After that, he went to the Catholic University of Louvain, Belgium, where he obtained a doctorate degree in philosophy. And then, after that, he went to Rome, where he obtained a doctorate in theology. If you're picking it up, Father Sheen was incredibly intelligent. As a young priest, he held 2 doctorate degrees. Father Sheen, because of all the degrees he had, was offered a teaching position at the University of Oxford, a position that he really wanted to accept. However, his bishop, Bishop Edmund Dunn, decided to assign him as the associate pastor of St. Patrick's Parish in Peoria, Illinois. And even though Father Sheen would have rather have accepted the teaching position at Oxford, he willingly obeyed his bishop and reported to St. Patrick's Parish. When Father Sheen arrived at St. Patrick's, he quickly realized that it was a dying parish. The pews were practically empty, not because of a coronavirus pandemic, but simply because of a lack of faith in that area. So what did he do? He went door to door in the surrounding neighborhood and invited people back to church. And in just 9 short months, the pews were full again. Bishop Dunn later told Father Sheen that he was testing his obedience. That's why he asked him to go to that parish, to see if he would be obedient to him. And Father Sheen passed the test with flying colors. Not only did he obey the bishop by going to the parish, but he gave his role as associate pastor his absolute best effort. So much so that he turned the parish around in 9 months. Knowing that Father Sheen had passed the test, his bishop did eventually let him accept that teaching position. Because of Father Sheen's obedience, a dying parish was completely made new again. The second saint I want to mention is Saint Maria Goretti. my personal favorite saint. She was a young girl who lived in the 20th century in Italy. At the young age of 11, a young man named Alessandro wanted to have relations with her. Maria Goretti loved Jesus so much that she wanted to keep all of his commandments, all of them. And so she declined Alessandro's advances. And Alessandro became so enraged with her no that he stabbed her brutally 14 times. And she died from her wounds the next day after having forgiven him on her deathbed. Maria Goretti loved Christ so much that she died a horrible death rather than disobey just one of his commandments. Let me repeat that. Maria Goretti, an 11-year-old girl, loved God so much that she died a horrible death rather than disobey just one of his commandments. Now that's true love. What good came from her obedience? Well, many things, but one of the most notable was that her murderer, Alessandro, had a conversion later in life, and people speculate that he will also become a canonized saint someday. St. John Chrysostom, a bishop in the 4th and 5th centuries, once said, "This is love, obeying and believing in the loved one." May this ring true in our lives.